Welcome everyone to episode 2 of Allsouthangler. I'm pretty excited to talk with you today. I'm Charlie Jones, and today we're going to be talking about catching redfish. The name of this episode is A New World, and that's what it seemed like. It seemed like a new world, going from freshwater fishing to inshore fishing that I just started, I guess, a little less than 3 years ago. It's not a long time to be doing it, but like I've said in a previous episode, it's 200 miles round trip for me to get to the Mississippi Gulf Coast and get exposure to some saltwater fishing. And I would say the last I looked, I put in 170 something days or 180 days in the last 2.5 years of fishing down on our Mississippi Gulf Coast. And that's what I want to try to get across in some of these first and early episodes, is really speaking to that new angler in the inshore environment. Maybe not a new angler in general, and that's applicable a lot. I mean, these are definitely applicable to a brand new angler that maybe already lives on the coast and wants to go out and try to experience what our great state has to offer. But also I want to speak also with maybe the advanced freshwater angler that already has a lot of the tackle, the rods, reels, boat, and things like that can go out and target these fish. But on the other side of that, what do you throw? What's a little different to throw? What's a little better to throw at some of these fish than opposed to bass fishing? And a lot of these bass fishing lures and plugs and hard baits and jerk baits, a lot of this stuff translates right over. I just don't use that. I've went another route, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. So I'm going with a little bit of a format here. I'm going to try to stick to it. I got a couple of bullet points and things. So one of the main things that you're going to have in just about any inshore environment is tide. You're going to have high tides, low tides, neap tides. And sometimes it's negated by river systems that are influencing tidal movements, like in the Pascagoula River system, where I personally fish a great deal. But those tidal movements have a lot to do with where fish are. They really do. The tides are influenced by moon phases, and a lot of these moon phases can be translated over to a solunar chart. That's, once again, a lot of these bullet points can have their own episodes, but I want to touch on them and bring them up so you can research them. But the solunar charts will translate over to tidal movements. And some people will say that they like high tides. I love fishing a high tide. I only fish an incoming tide or an outgoing tide, and I hate neap tides. Well, I'm here to tell you, I've caught fish on all of them, every one of them. There's spots to be fished for every one of those tidal movements or changes. There's spots that are going to be productive in the middle of an outgoing tide, at the end of an outgoing tide, or at dead tide where there's no movement. So don't think just because there's not an incoming tide that day or an outgoing tide that day that it's not going to be a good day. And you'll see a lot of these fishing apps, which are great. I use Null Tide or Tides for Fishing. It's really kind of like a one-stop shop or a one source for all of the solunar data, tides, wind, weather, barometric pressure, all of this stuff. It's all in these. But I guess what I want to say is, don't let what would seem like perfect situations or the perfect climate dictate whether or not you go fishing. I've had plenty of people tell me, I wouldn't go tomorrow, Charlie, you're not going to catch fish, and I've slayed them. I've slayed them. You're never going to know unless you go. All right. So, look those things up. Look up, tide dynamics. Look up high and low tides. Look up solunar, and look up tidal coefficients. Tidal coefficients speak to during that low tide movement, during that high tide movement. All right. How much water is going to be moving with what kind of force, and that's all dictated by moon phases. So the tide it is a big deal. And the next thing that I would like to speak to is structure. You know, the environment you're going to be fishing in an inshore environment. Sure, there's going to be places that have, you know, boat docks and some stumps and, you know, some rubble and rocks and such like that. There's going to be those places around a lot, you know, around the outer banks of some of your inshore environment. When you get to the interior marsh, a lot of that stuff disappears unless it gets blown in. So you're not going to have your treetops and stuff like that. The occasional laid down log that's floated through maybe to fish, which are great for sheep's head, by the way. But the structure that you're going to find in an inshore or an interior marsh environment is going to be in the way of contour changes or topography. You know, the points in the middle of a bend back on a bayou or a channel, that deeper bank on the outside of that point that the current causes by rolling around that switchback, ledges in the middle of channels, grass lines, man. Grass lines, whether it be closer to the bank or further away from the bank, grass lines are where it's at as far as the main channels. But I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, 75% of my slot fish come from feeder creeks or ditches that will extend away from the main channel, that will maybe sometimes weave back around to hit that channel or another channel, but sometimes they end into nothingness. They'll narrow and narrow and narrow to a point where you can't turn your boat around in it, or you can't go anymore due to it being shallow or just abruptly stopping. But man, those fish, they push up in there, and they push up in there hard. But I want to speak to that. I want to speak to where the good places are to fish during high tide and low tide in the channels and these creeks and so on and so forth. But understand this: redfish are not much different than any other fish. They're going to have their periods where they're the most aggressive, and they're going to have the periods where it's tough to catch them. And just like any other fish, the dog days of summer, right in the middle of the heat of the summer, and in the dead of winter when the temps are getting really cold and the water temps drop down below, I mean, I would say about 60 degrees, 62 degrees, they really start getting really sluggish. I'm not saying the fish won't bite, but it really slows down. And I can speak to tactics that I've developed in some presentations that I developed for that I've had great success with. But let's talk about the aggressive times. Let's talk about from you know, early fall through late fall. Let's talk about, you know, spring. You know, spring, the beginning and end of spring, beginning and end of fall, and a little bit honestly into winter, until those water temps really start dropping. But when they're aggressive. So what I'd like to do, and once again, this is not, I don't have a lot of fancy stuff. I don't know how to do a lot of this awesome editing and superimpose these pictures and all this. I'm just a guy in his shop trying to pass on some knowledge to some folks that I can speak to, that I have personally pounded out on the water and I know that work. So just use your imagination, stick with me, and let's see if I can get my point across on fishing some grass in the channels. All right, what might look like a mere notebook is a channel or a bayou. And I told you once again, folks, we're going to have to use our imagination. So if you look at any sort of satellite imagery of a channel or a bayou, you'll notice what looks like exposed grass that is always above water. You'll see some dark tint along the edges, and then you'll have the middle, your main channel. Well, please, for the sake of this, follow me out here. I'm sure it's laughable, but stick with me. Let's say the edges of this notebook here are exposed grass, right? And everything in this notebook could be water. All right. This grass here is usually Spartina grass, predominantly in our Mississippi Gulf Coast. It's always above water. I mean, unless there's just drastic, horrible flooding. I'm talking about world event kind of thing. But inside of here, let's say this is our tidal range movement, okay? And when you get in these channels, a lot of times, let's say it's high tide, and the water is out into the Spartina grass here, and the channel is covered with water. You'll see these dark lines a lot of times, these dark lines here under the water, and then out to the edges it'll kind of look light again. Well, what this is usually is eelgrass. This eelgrass is constantly submerged. All right, it is a submerged vegetation. It is very dense. A lot of times bait fish will be in it at low tide, but rarely will redfish push into it at low tide. It's just so dense. It's a hard ambush point for them. So this grass cannot exist or live outside of the water. If it is exposed to oxygen too long, for a long period of time, even in a drought, it will die. So that's what leaves these mud banks here when the low tide is in, because when low tide is in, I can almost guarantee you that it'll be very close to these outside edges when the water is very low. That's why that grass stops growing here, because at low tide, that water on average stays here, so the grass can still grow. Okay, when high tide comes in, the water then begins to move out into the Spartina grass and floods the Spartina grass, at which point the water will become higher over the top of the eelgrass, and the fish will move over it into these that I like to think of as highways right here. And these can be anywhere from 1 foot to 4 or 5 foot wide, according to the graduation of the bank. So let's talk about low tide fishing this grass. So low tide fishing this grass is pretty easy, because you can't fish here. It's exposed, it's dry, right? So you're going to be concentrating your efforts along this weed line. I've had instances where you would think, all right, setting up here and making a long cast right down the edge of the bank will cover the most of the strike zone. And a lot of times that is the case, and that works a lot of the times. Sometimes I don't know if it's skittish or they're focusing on certain prey, but sometimes the same place I would cast here 4 or 5 times, making a long cast down this weed line, I would receive no bites. But as my boat drifted and I began to 45 cast, pitching over here and pulling and letting my lure fall over this grass and pull it back, I would start receiving bites, and that was the pattern for that day. So, make sure you're always trying something different, and also whenever it's low tide and the water's down really low, especially if the water's starting to cool off or get really warm, they'll concentrate right in the center. They'll concentrate right in the center. All right. So, of course, it's easy to say that this is your target zone here whenever it's low, up the sides of the grass in the center. I like to a lot of times run right down the center, and I will fan cast. And then whenever I make a good fan cast, maybe even sometimes come back, I'll receive no bites, I'll move up the length of my cast with my vessel, with my boat, and I'll do the same thing until I start realizing, hey, I'm getting a lot of bites in the center, or I'm getting a lot of bites on this bank over here because the wind is blowing into it. And then whenever I figure out that pattern, I concentrate on that pattern. All right, so now let's talk about high tide. It's far different. So with high tide, when the water moves out, the water will flood into this Spartina grass. And whenever it floods into this grass, it gives the redfish and most all fish in the inshore environment a much bigger playground, a bigger buffet. They will a lot of times either find breaks in this grass to pass through to get into these highways here, or they will just physically hop right over the top of this grass to access not only these banks here, but to access this Spartina grass, and they'll nose right up in it. There's fiddler crabs, there's crickets, there's whatever. I mean, they'll eat birds, whatever, it's living here. So when that water moves up into it, it allows them access, and they'll concentrate a lot of times right in this zone. And according to the tide, whether it's just coming over the grass or the tide's falling, it's going back down over the grass, even though this area is flooded, they still may be holding here. They still may hold here. So fish, you gotta beat it to a pulp. You gotta try all the options until you nail down a pattern. And once again, it holds true as before. If it's really hot, the water temperatures are really hot or getting really cold, they're gonna hold in the center. So don't, you know, there's a lot of concentrations here during those lower activity seasons during the time of this. So I hope that all makes sense with my little planter here and my two-sided green tape for grass, but maybe that sheds a little light on how to concentrate the efforts and to pick apart what would look like a basic burying channel to a freshwater fisherman with no structure. That's how the fish have shown me to hold. So now the next question, what are we using to do all this with? You know, what am I throwing? What's a good thing to throw that's readily available? All right, I can tell you this presentation right here, this lure right here it's a confidence bait for me for sure. It has, over the last 2.5 years, probably caught well in the neighborhood of 75% of my fish. It's very versatile. You can jig it, you can steady retrieve it, you can burn it, you can skip it across the top, fish structure with it. But all right, let's get to it. What is it? All right, well, first off, let's talk about the hook, which to me is a big part of it. This rig here is made by owner. It's called a Flashy Swimmer. I prefer the 1/0, 1/8 ounce rig. I've tried the larger ones. From here it steps up to a 3/16 and a 3/0 hook. I find that 3/0 hook to be a little large for a lot of the plastics that I throw, and I even find that the weight and the blade to be a little large for how I fish. And that might not be the case to other people, but that's my opinion. Let's pull this guy out of the pack here, and I'll show you kind of what it looks like. It's kind of hard to make it out with all those colors in that pack there. So right here is what we have. You can see it on my dirty work table here. She's seen a lot of miles, but we have a somewhat forward belly weight terminated to this I want to say almost like a heavy steel leader material. It's pretty hard to bend. It's important to note that here it goes to a double swivel and then what I believe to be a #2 gold Colorado blade. It's a screw lock type with a center pin, which makes it really easy to line it up in your plastic and rig it. Now, let's see if I can get a little bit more of a close-up shot here and take a look at that guy. It's a great lure. So what does that look like in the plastic? Now, I've mentioned before, I'm a huge Matrix Shad fan, but for this presentation, I am not. And it's just for the way that the Matrix Shad rigs and is designed. And I'll show that later. But I prefer the tried and true Bass Assassin, the Sea Shad. And you'll notice here it's chicken on a chain. And the reason why I picked that is it just seems to really closely relate to the color of a lot of the bait fish in the area. And I really think that the accent of the chartreuse tail there paddling away is another real big strike bonus for these fish. But this is what we look like rigged up. All right, you can see here that I do not have it pinched back like a lot of bass fishermen like to do. I will do that if I get into a lot of structure, but I prefer to leave my hook exposed. Another little trick that I've learned, when you first initially rig this and the first time you push this hook through, this plastic can have a lot of stiction on that hook. And you can see we don't have really a ton of gap here between the hook shank and the plastic body here. And it needs that movement to be able to move, to clear the hook for a fish to be able to get that and to have a good hook set. I wish they made a 2/0, but they don't. But here's a few things that I do to try to increase my hook sets. And what I like to do is take it and give it a little push towards the back, a little maybe pull towards the front. And what I'm trying to do is to rip a small little slot in that to give it, a little bit, make it a little easier where there's not so much grabbing on that hook shank. And after you catch a few fish on it and it goes through casting and slamming against the water, up against the boat and the bank and everything else, you'll naturally work your way out of there. That's one thing that I like to do. And a lot of people will probably see some controversy in the next thing I'm about to tell you, but I've caught some 8, 9, 10-pound redfish on this, and that's an inshore trophy. Now, I'm not talking about going after bulls with this thing. I'm talking about fishing your, most of the fish, 95% of the fish you're going to encounter inside the Mississippi marsh. So what I like to do is get my thumbnail under this guy here, and I'll pull her up just a little bit. I'll try to get her facing up just a little bit. I don't know if you can really see that good with the camera, but she's just got hook's a little bit more separated from that plastic. And a lot of people say, well, you just affected the temper of the hook or this, that, or the other. Well, and all I can tell you is use your drag and fight the fish. So that guy right there, that's a killer. I mean, it is an absolute killer. And what I'd like to show you, and I've played around with it, and you can trim it and make it work, but what I'd like to show you is why I don't really use this bait a lot with the matrix shad is for this reason. Chaz even said it whenever he developed this lure. He developed the lure with a very abrupt, flat front to make the plastic have a little more meat in the front to grab that jig head and to stay on the jig head better. And you can see that this has a much more predominant belly to it than the sea shad had. So these two things together just really affect how this hook here works on here. And I'll try to see if I can quickly explain this to you. But let's get this guy rigged on there pretty close. And when we go to pull it down, find out, what I like to do is kind of see where the hook wants to be at, and then I trace right back through that same area. Push her out the top. Okay. Well, what you can see here, I don't know if you can really make that out, but that belly is already laying up against that lead. And I just feel like it doesn't really have the downward movement needed. And I could be wrong. And it might just be because that's what I started out with. That was a high confidence lure for me. And plus it binds up in the front because of that abrupt, I don't know if you can see that, but the abrupt head going into this longer angle here, it really kind of binds up. And I guess I wasn't comfortable enough with it, and I've never really thrown it a lot on this rig, and I kind of stick with the sea shad. But this, like I said, this is the go-to, the meat and potatoes for me. It's a great search bait. You can burn it fast. You can straight steady retrieve with a little pop to it every now and then. You can jig it off bottom. I've even drifted it just about dead in current before, and that blade working and caught fish. So let's talk about where we would use this. When was this a good time to use? Well, pretty much through that exact explanation I just had of where fish may hold on that creek channel. You can take this lure here and pull this lure over this grass during a high tide. All right, you can throw it right up against the bank, pull it through that highway over that grass, and then let it drop off into the deep of that channel during high tides, and then they will nail it. Or during low tides when all the water is in the center. That's, this is what you can, a technique I like to do because it is pretty weedless, is throw it into the grass, maybe a foot or two into the grass. It'll kind of hide the sound of your lure hitting and not spook fish as much. And then I pull it into the channel and let it drop off into the main channel. Maybe give it a couple of pops, a couple of jigs, and then start a steady retrieve and so on, and just figure out what the fish wants. This is a highly effective search bait. All right, now the second one. Second one's probably what everybody and their brother has heard about, used, thrown, and that is the Poppin Court. All right, this here is a Four Horsemen. I've kind of grown to really like the Four Horsemen brand. They have a different sound, really durable. They're a really great court. Another one that's really readily available in a lot of stores is the Cajun Thunder. The Cajun Thunder court is a great one. There's nothing to take away from this cork right here. You'll see I'm showing you a lot of pencil corks. I do, or pencil bobbers they'll call them, but I do consider these to be poppin corks, even though they don't have the traditional cylindrical look to them with the the cupped top that actually does make a popping sound. But this is still technically a popping cork presentation. Why do I use the cigar shaped ones? Well, for a number of reasons. Number one, they cast way better in the wind, way better in the wind. You can get some real long cast out of them. They don't tumble as easily because of that heavier, larger mass popping cork trying to drag through the air. And I think the second reason would be that there's a decent amount of fishing pressure where we're at, and fish can get kind of skittish sometimes. And I think that the pencil cork, and this is actually called I think the skinny cork by Four Horsemen, is, it'll do the job. It'll call the fish. It's got the rattle to it, right? But it's not too much. It's not this huge explosion on top of the water, but it's enough to gain their interest. And that's the way these corks work. When it's sitting in the water, it's sitting at a resting position this way with it pulled down. When your line pulls on this rod, it clicks and it lays over, and it causes a ruckus and a splash on top of the water. But then it sets back down and you get that second pop. So both ways it makes a pop. All right, and how that works is you put your leader right to what I prefer the most is a voodoo shrimp. All right, this is the packaging you would be looking for a voodoo shrimp. That right there, I want to say, is Cajun pepper, is what they call it. Everybody has this color pretty much. That's correct, Cajun pepper. Cajun pepper is a killer. I mean, it is a killer. It's an absolute hammer. I like this color here for a lot more dark stained water. It's almost pretty much black with some red flake in it with a chartreuse tail. Good contrast in your really muddy and really stained water. And then when it starts getting a little bit clearer and so on, I like to go to the more translucent Cajun pepper. I mean, it's great. So with the Poppin Court, this leader length can vary. This is actually, pretty short, not too short. I've caught them with this length, definitely. And with this shorter length, you can fish the inside of that grass line between the submerged grass and the Spartina grass, that highway. With this shorter length, you can effectively fish that pretty well without getting on bottom. But let's say it's it's high water, but they're still holding on the center channel side of the submerged or eelgrass. Well, you might want to go a little longer to get down beside that grass a little more. You can play with these lengths. Some people go all the way up to 36 inches. And this right here is a good starting point. I would say between here and about 18 to 20 inches is my max that I throw. But both of these presentations, this with the flashy swimmer, if I only could fish 2 presentations to try to get on some redfish, that would be it for sure. So there you have the 2 main presentations that I started off with and that I still use today. These presentations can catch a lot of fish, and they can be fished in a lot of different areas and a lot of different conditions, at high, low, or even the neap tide. But what I've said before, and I'll say it again, that I really think separates the pros from the bros is repeatability. You got to constantly be paying attention to everything you're doing, because when you get that bite, you need to know what you were doing so that you can repeat it, so that you can try to do it again. It doesn't mean that right around the corner or within the next 10 or 15 yards there's going to be a likewise place to make that presentation to a fish that could be holding in a similar spot. But the more you fish an area and learn an area and pick an area to spend some days on and put the time in to find out where different spots are, you'll know different places that you can go to and get on fish when you pattern them out. So we talked about tide, and we talked about a lot of the different places to catch them, and how there can be a lot of differences. It can be overwhelming coming from freshwater to saltwater. But know that you're not going to have all of these tidal ranges in one day. Some days, most days, you're going to have either an all falling or an all rising tide. And there'll be those days where, you know, you're going to see the peak in the middle of the day or a little bit towards the end of the day, but you got to be ready to change. You really got to be a shaker and a mover. You know, just if you know in your mind, keep a conscious thought, like say 1 o'clock is going to be peak tide. She's rising at 1 o'clock, it's going to peak, and by 2:30 she's falling again. All right, well, if that bite starts to die off around 12:15 or 12:30, guess what? The fish are moving, they're transitioning, they're changing. All right, so it's time for you to change with them. And I would love to tell you, hey, for sure hit these exact places during dead tide, during, you know, dead low or high tide. But it's tough. That is a tough fishing time in the inshore environment. I can tell you what I like to do. I like to fish places that are otherwise hard or impossible to fish otherwise, right? Like pitching in between bridge pilings. You can't pitch a 2.5 or 3 foot wide area with incoming and outgoing tide because you're just, you know, especially if it's 8, 10, 12 foot deep or so, it's just going to sweep your lure right into the columns and you're going to stay hung up or not really hardly catch the fish if they bite anyway. But if that water stops because it's not falling or rising and it's just stopped, you can get in there and you can fish those areas. You can fish boat docks and pilings and other things like that if you're in a heavy current area, because some places, man, when that current starts moving, whether it's rising or falling, it's cooking. All right, I mean, it is cooking. And that you can't fish around a lot of structure unless you're just fishing directly down to it. So keep that in mind as you cross places. You're like, hey, I just can't fish that because of this current or the way my presentation I'm forced to throw. Think about, hey, is this something I can hit, you know, during neap tide before I go to change my tactics? But be willing to change, man. Be willing to know that the bite can stop and the bite can change. And if it stops working, sometimes you can't just keep doing the same thing and expect to catch fish. You got to swap it up. You got to change it up. So thanks for sitting here and letting me show you a couple of some proven tactics for me and some proven presentations. And these are some minimal investment presentations that I think that everyone can catch fish on. They really can. So I'll leave with, like I usually do, man, get out there and see what Mississippi has to offer. If you don't travel down to our coast a lot and see a lot of that inshore environment, there's room for everybody. Be respectful on the water. Give people their distance. You know, don't run up on people. There's a lot of people on the water right now with all that's going on with the virus and so on, and a lot of new people on the water that might not understand the way things work. So just give them their distance. You know, if you can take your rod and reel and cast even remotely close to another vessel, you're probably too close. So be respectful on the water, pay attention. Let's try not to have any accidents. Get out there and enjoy what Mississippi has to offer. You don't know unless you go. If they're biting, you got to go to know. So God bless you, and we'll see you next time.